All through Mark's gospel, it feels like Jesus has been saying the same thing over and over and over again, which is that he will have to go to Jerusalem and he will have to be crucified, that he will rise again. He's been saying this for a long time now, and he keeps saying it to the disciples, and they keep not really hearing him. They keep protesting against this message, saying, "This could not happen to you, Lord." But in actuality, I think in some ways they understand that this message is about them as well. And so when they're saying this could not happen to you, they're saying, don't let this happen to me. I don't want this thing for myself. Because what Jesus is talking about, what he's calling them into, is transformation, which is a deep conversion of the entire self, a remaking of your very being. And there is a very real way in which the way of the cross, that path to Jerusalem, that death upon the cross, is the story of all transformation. It is a transformation that happens to all of us. Because when we are transformed, when we are converted, the thing that we experience, largely, is pain, is suffering. So Jesus is saying to the disciples, I am going to suffer, and then I'll be reborn. And they are hearing, and you will too. And they are saying, we do not want that, right? And why would they, really? But all along, he's giving them examples of what it will be like when they are reborn, what they will look like when they have been transformed. So he goes up on a mountain with 3 of his disciples, and he is transfigured. Clouds come over him, his garments become dazzling white, and it is as if he's saying to them, this is what you'll be like. Don't worry, you'll end up like this. But then, just in case I think it's all going to be glory and clouds and really bleached clothing, when he comes back down the mountain, he takes children, and he holds them up. He points to them, and he says, that's what you'll be like when you are transformed. You will be like children. That is, you will have a sense of wonder. You will not worry too much about the future. You will be able to live in the moment. You will have this grace about you, which young children particularly very often have. So he's giving them these examples, and yet they're still really worried. They still don't really want the thing, even though they know where it will lead. That entire process of the cross, that entire process of pain and suffering is not something that they want to enter into. And in the light of that, in the light that we've really had 10 chapters of this up until this point, what the disciples say today seems actually kind of remarkable, right? He uses a new metaphor. He says, instead of you have to go to the cross, he says you have to drink the cup that I drink from, right? You have to be baptized in the way I'm baptized. So again, he's saying you have to transform. You have to undergo a process of transformation. What we hear the apostles say today is, all right, we get it. We will do it. We'll go along. We'll drink that cup. We'll be baptized, which is a significant improvement over what has been going on before. But it leads us to this question. Why is it that any inward transformation, any remaking of the self, can really only be described through the cross, through blood, through fire? Why is it that it is so painful, that it is so hard to do? Well, I had an inkling of this, or an interesting conversation, kind of tangential to this, a couple of weeks ago when I went down to Franklinton to spend an evening with the Confluence volunteers. I don't know, do any of you know who the Confluence volunteers are? They're Episcopal Service Corps members, so they're young people, almost always right out of college. This year, all 4 of them are right out of college, who commit to spend a year living in community together, so in a house. They develop a rule of life together, and then they work as volunteers in different social service agencies throughout town, throughout the city. So here in Columbus, they're at the food bank, they're at the refugee services, they're all over the place. and they're really wonderful. And they asked me to come down to teach them centering prayer, which, I don't know, have any of you any experience with centering prayer? It's always good to get a sense of your audience and see whether it's a completely foreign language one is speaking. Centering prayer is essentially Christian contemplation. You probably are somewhat familiar with the idea of Zen Buddhism. Centering prayer is more or less a Christian version of that, although it goes all the way back to the 6th century. So it goes a long time through our tradition. There has been the thought that really the thing that we're called to as Christians is simply to rest in the presence of God. That is our main call. And centering prayer is a way of learning how to do that, really. And the way you learn how to do that is becoming aware of your mind. There's this great Greek word. So those of you who like really esoteric Greek words, write this down. It's called nepsis, which means the mind watching the mind. Nepsis. So what you do when you enter into centering prayer is first you become aware of your body. So you become aware of your breath and kind of how your body feels. And then you spend a minute or two softening your heart, so thinking of something that touches you deeply. And then you state an intention. You say, while I'm in this period of centering prayer, I want to be at peace, or I want to be at rest, or I want to be deeply in touch with you, Jesus. And then you let that intention go. You say, I may want to do the thing, but it's really not up to me. Whatever happens here is of God, and I will not try and control it. And then you choose a word, and then you try not to think. Ha ha. So any of you who have ever tried not to think know how very, very difficult this is, right? If we could do this easily, I could say to you now, don't think for 5 minutes, and you would sit there and not a thought would pass through your head. But it is incredibly hard to do because we have all of these thoughts that are traveling through our minds all of the time. And the best teaching I know about this comes from Thomas Keating, who says, when you're trying to do this, you don't want to beat yourself up. If you have a thought, you don't want to say to yourself, oh, I'm so stupid I had that thought, or, get angry at the thought, or anything like that. He says, imagine that you're sitting on a riverbank, and that your thoughts are little boats traveling down the river. And you can notice them there. You can say, oh, I'm thinking that thing. But you don't get on the boat and travel with it, right? That's what you try to avoid doing. You will, however, fail constantly. You will be always getting on that boat and trying to travel down that river. And at that point, when you notice yourself doing that, you just try and call yourself back to the riverbank, through a word usually, like spirit or God or love. So I taught this to the Confluence volunteers, and we were sitting there in the sanctuary at St. John's, and we sat for 20 minutes in centering prayer, which is about as long as most Westerners can stand. And then afterwards, we began to process it. We were like, well, what happened? What did you notice? What did you realize? And one particular volunteer said that the thing she realized was that until that moment, she had always believed that if she had a thought, then she would be done with that thought. Like you were reading a book. Most books, you read a book, and there's one point, and then there's another point, and another point, and they build towards the conclusion. You reach the conclusion, and you're done with the book. And she thought that was how her mind worked. But what she realized was that instead, she has the same thought over and over and over again, which would make for the most boring book in the world. But this is what happens to her. She has a script working through her whenever, when she was sitting there trying to pray. And it made me realize that she is not alone, that probably most of us do this. We have certain scripts in our mind that just play through again and again and again, almost like they were computer code that was just playing through. And there may be periods in our life when we don't hear those scripts, or maybe months, maybe even years when we are rid of them. But they often come back. Very, very often they come back. And we hear them again. And if we are called to transformation, one of the things we are called to is letting go of those scripts. It's not believing them anymore, or not thinking them, anymore, not being caught and defined by them anymore. So some of those scripts that I can think of right now are really emotional scripts. I often think that emotions could be organized on a kind of color wheel. Those of you who know painting know that color wheels have contrasting colors. So purple, a combination of red and blue, for instance, is exactly opposite yellow because they're the greatest contrast you can have on that wheel. And I think that many of our emotions function in exactly that way. So for instance, if I were to make a color wheel of the emotions, I might put anger here and I might put grief exactly opposite. And this comes from something a very wise woman told me a little while ago. She said that whenever she feels really angry at somebody, at a friend or a parent or a child, she realizes that in fact she's grieving over something in her relationship with that person, and that she's angry at them as a way to screen her grief so that she won't let herself feel it. So she's nitpicking. She's saying, oh, why does this person do this or that or this? But what's really going on is that something has changed in their relationship. Something has died, really, in their relationship. And she doesn't want to sit in grief, because of grief you have no control over, right? She wants to go for anger, where she can blame, where she can point the finger. So they may be opposite each other. In the same way, at least in my life, I think that shame and control are opposite each other. Because I think, for me at least, and this may be true of you, that when I'm trying to be very controlling in any situation, maybe in a relationship, maybe in something to do with work, it's often because there has been some moment in my past when I have failed in a similar situation, often failed miserably. I've either failed the relationship by doing something that hurt the other person, or I failed in work by not paying enough attention and not being careful enough, maybe not caring enough. Or maybe I've just done something basically and stupidly embarrassing, right? And I may have been the only one there for it, but I know it. And it's one of my scripts. It's become something that comes up again and again and again. And I convince myself that if I could just assert enough control, I would not have to feel shame. That I would put myself out of the danger of feeling any shame at all. And these are the scripts that I think just work through us, that have us captive in a way. We have scripts around shame, about anger, around grief, around control, and probably many other things. Each of us probably has our own internal color wheel of contrasting emotions. But we do this to ourselves, and we get caught in it. We get trapped in it. And yet, even though we know that it's destructive to us, it is also deeply comforting, because it is the thing we know the best. It's the thing we know how to do. If you are caught in grief, if you are grieving something that has died in your life, it is so much more comforting to be angry than it is to just sit in that grief and be sorrowful. So we have this old self that needs to be transformed, and this old self is made up of these scripts that just run through us again and again and again. And maybe the first step to transformation is simply noticing what they are and being able to name them. A little like naming demons in a way. But as important as that is, and I think it is very important to find moments of silence, places in your life where you can listen to yourself and have God listen to you. As important as that is, probably the most important thing to my mind in terms of transformation is patience. Almost a gravitational patience. A patience that is so long and so deep that it is like the patience of Jesus with the disciples, even as they get it repeatedly wrong. Because the thing that we tend to do when we're in transformation is that we tend to look at that self that is being transformed and say, hurry up. What are you doing, still sitting there, going through all this long transformation? I want the resurrection now. I want it to happen today. I don't want it 10 years from now or whenever it might be. get incredibly patient at this part of you which is changing, and so you bully it. You just bully it again and again, waking up in the morning. Why am I not different? Waking up the next morning. Why am I not different now? Why has the thing not been resolved? Why is my relationship not healed? We have this great difficulty with letting ourselves simply grow and transform and trusting that process. And yet, it's a little like a scab, right? This part of us can be incredibly wounded and trying to heal or trying to change. It can be incredibly fragile, like an infant or an egg. And the thing we want to do is just pick at it, rip at it, until it goes away out of some belief that somehow we'll help it to emerge into its new life. But we're just doing it more and more damage. And that, I think, is why, really, Jesus says to the disciples, I believe you. I believe that you can drink that cup. I believe that you can enter into that baptism. I even believe that you can go to the cross. But I don't know, and I'm not going to tell you, that you will get to sit at my left hand and my right hand. I'm not going to say to you, your transformation is according to some schedule that you can control, and that you're going to know where it's going to take you in the end, because that would be untrue. Even Jesus, who, Lord of all, understands everything, is willing to be patient with transformation, not rush it to the end. So I'm going to end with a quote from Rilke, Rainer Maria Rilke, great 20th century poet, much loved today for very good reasons, was already famous by the time he was a young man, and already a published and acknowledged poet. And another young man, another poet, started writing him letters and saying, how can I become a published and acknowledged poet? And Rilke wrote back to him a series of beautiful letters, which then came to be really his most famous work, which are Letters to a Young Poet. And in the midst of them is probably his most famous quote. But I want you to hear, if you know this quote, I want you to listen as closely to the beginning as you do to the end. Rilke writes to this young poet, and he says, I want to beg you, as much as I can, be patient toward all that is unresolved in your heart. Be patient toward all that is unresolved in your heart. Try to live the questions themselves like locked rooms or books that are written in a foreign tongue. Do not now seek the answers. They cannot be given to you now, because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. You will then, gradually, without even noticing it perhaps, live along someday into the answer. As Christians, we are called to this process of transformation, which is a fearsome, sometimes very painful process. But we can't control it. We cannot bully it along. We cannot claim answers for ourselves that we have not yet had the patience to discover. It is our calling to be gentle and patient with ourselves as we live these questions.